Dear colleagues, my name is Michel Perotino. I am the head of the Department of Political Science of the Institute of Political Studies at the Faculty of Social Sciences of the Charles University here in Prague. I am very glad and honored to officially open the Steinrücken Lecture in the name of the local organizers and on behalf of the ECPR. Unfortunately, this year, this lecture and the joint sessions have to be online due to the pandemic. However, I hope we will soon be able to go back into some version of the old normality of direct gathering, full of informality and human reality. I hope that we will meet here in Prague, at least in 2024, for the ECPR joint sessions. I would like to thank Hanna Kubatova, a member of the ECPR Executive Committee, who has coordinated this year's events, and to all the members of the ECPR staff. It's my great pleasure to present to you the person who organized this meeting at our department, Petra Guasti, who is now, since February of this year, our new colleague and newly associate professor of democratic theory. Petra joined our department after many years abroad. Her journey took for her from the Czech Academy of Science, where she's on leave, to cities like Bremen, Würzburg, Mainz, Frankfurt, and Cambridge, Massachusetts. In March 2019, she completed an 8-month visiting democracy fellowship at Harvard University's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. She focused on the contemporary reconfiguration of representative democracy. And in April 2021, Petra completed her habilitation, Democracy Disrupted, at the Goethe University, Frankfurt. Petra's research focuses on reconfiguring the political landscape and revolves around 3 major themes: representation, democratization, and of course, populism. As a scholar and as a person who crossed the metaphorical bridge between the East and the West many times, back and forth, Petra is well situated to moderate this debate with leading scholars of comparative politics. Thank you, Petra, for chairing this ECPR Steinrücken lecture with such great speakers. And please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Michel. That's it's wonderful. Thank you. I feel really welcome and a bit shy. But to put on the hat of somebody who crosses the bridge. So welcome everybody. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this Steinrücken lecture. How we will proceed, I will first briefly introduce our topic, perhaps saying some words, being a little bit provocative on purpose, trying to stimulate our discussion and questions. Then I will introduce our panelists, and we will proceed with the questions and their input. So starting with a couple of words. So what are the East and the West? The East is a loosely defined set of countries that spent more than half a 20th century behind the Iron Curtain. But what is the West? Liberal democracies, the US and the EU countries. But perhaps the East and the West are shortcuts, attempting to simplify complex reality, difficult to grasp for those who live it, who study it, and who gaze at it. If they are constructs, it's possible to reconstruct them, not along what makes them distinct, but what they share. The one common aspect across the region and the world is the decline of democratic quality in the last decade. The symptoms include declining trust in democratic institutions, emboldened uncivil society, increased political control over media, civic apathy, and nationalistic contestation. There is little agreement on the symptoms, causes, effects, and trajectory of this ongoing change, decline in the quality of democracy. The East and the West are stereotypes rooted in some historical reality, but counterproductive 3 decades later as they thwart systematic study of change. Overgeneralization and underconceptualization prevent us from seeing both the variation and the similarities across the East and West. Perhaps we ought to focus on historical legacies, elite choices, institutional variation, and the difference in the agency of citizens to play an active part in the democratic processes. 30 years after the fall of Iron Curtain, comparative research still struggles with incorporating Central and Eastern Europe into mainstream comparative research. Many are quick to see these countries as predestined to failure, democracy too shallow, and perhaps only emulated. Institutions in the youngish democracies may have shallow roots and citizen attitudes may be less stable, but this is increasingly the case in Western democracies. And so when Western democracies and scholars of Western democracy are gazing at the East, perhaps they are gazing into their own future. This panels assemble scholars whose work transcends the East-West divide to discuss how to move beyond this perhaps outdated paradigm, how to bridge the East-West divide. The panelists are eminent scholars of political parties, social movements, and democracy, and touch many of these issues in their work. It's my pleasure to invite you to discuss ways of balancing out general trends and unique features of Central and Eastern Europe. Let me now briefly introduce you to the panelists in the order as they will speak. Fernando Casal Bertoa is an associate professor in comparative politics at the University of Nottingham. He studied law in Pamplona, political science in Salamanca, and Central and Eastern European studies at Jagiellonian University. Fernando and Zsolt Enyedi have recently published a monograph titled Party System Closures, Party Alliances, Government, Alternative and Democracy in Europe with Oxford University Press. Fernando holds many awards, but for the sake of, if you're interested, you can look at the ECPR website to see them all. Our next speaker is Professor Zsolt Enyedi. Zsolt is Professor of Political Science at the Central European University and a Leverhulme Visiting Professor at Oxford University. Professor Enyedi focuses in his research on party politics, comparative government, church and state relations, and political psychology, especially authoritarianism, prejudices, and political tolerance. He is also recipient and winner of many awards, and the other parent, the co-parent of the Party Systems Closure book. Lenka Bustikova is our next speaker and is joining us from Phoenix, Arizona. She grew up in Prague, and we are very proud that she is the alumna of the Faculty of Social Sciences of the Charles University in Prague. After crossing her bridge to the West, she earned PhD in political science from Duke University and she's holder of many other master degrees. She's now associate professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies in Arizona at Arizona State University. Her research focuses on party politics, voting behavior, clientelism, state capacity, with a special reference to Eastern Europe. Her book, Extreme Reactions, Radical Right Mobilization in Eastern Europe, with Cambridge University Press, won also many important awards, and she also won other awards, which you can see all on the ECPR website. Our next speaker is Professor Ondrej Cisar. Ondrej is a professor of sociology at the Faculty of Social Sciences, Charles University in Prague, and is also affiliated to the Institute of Sociology of the Czech Academy of Sciences. Ondrej's research in political sociology focuses on social movements, political protest, and comparative politics. His current project includes climate justice activism and the role of expertise in the public sphere. And finally, Professor Milada Vachudova, who is also joining us from United States, specializes in party systems, political change in post-communist Europe. She is a Jean Monnet Chair and Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and she is part of the core team of the Chapel Hill Expert Survey. I would be remiss not to mention one of my favorite books, Europe Undivided, which is authored by Professor Vachudova. Europe Undivided, Democracy, Leverage and Integration After Communism with Oxford University Press was awarded the Stein-Rokan Prize for Comparative Social Science Research. So these are our eminent scholar, and without further ado, we will now proceed with the questions. So first I ask to all of you a question, which I will read so that our audience knows, and then I will address the question which was individually for you. So to all, in your research, you have studied phenomena from party system through radical right, social movements, and democratic backsliding. Your work shows that all these can be observed both in the West and in the East. How does your research grapple with balancing out general trends and unique features of the Central and Eastern European region? And to our first additional question, to our first speaker, Fernando Casal Bertoa, your recent published book is an unparalleled tour de force. You cover 65 European party systems from 1848 until 2019. Comparatively, you show an increasing convergence between the Western and the Eastern European party systems. Can you elaborate on the convergence? Do important differences prevail?
Thank you very much to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I will then try to give a brief, understanding from our work together with Zsolt and Enyedi on this issue of convergence, right? And also of how we look at this, let's say, a comparison between East and West, using, going to the first question, different, methodologies and different approaches. So what we see clearly is a process of convergence in three arenas: electoral, parliamentarian, and governmental. We all remember, the early works, early post-transition scholars that predicted that with time, post-communist party systems would become, as institutionalized as those consolidated Western European democracies. Even drew from examples from Southern Europe, the other region that I know quite well, to show how the future would look in the East, right? But we have other scholars like Peter Mann himself, who were more skeptical. In 1995, he was talking already about or predicting that post-communist party systems would remain largely unstable. And in an article that we published 3 years ago in a special issue in East European Politics and Societies, we found that Mayer was mostly right, not in every detail, and that post-communist party systems certainly remain at large unstable, right? And moreover, and what is, I think it is ironically and very interesting that the changes in the West, however, were matching and mimicking the trajectories in the East. In the book that you mentioned kindly enough in our presentation, we'll go in deep into this issue of the convergence of party systems between East and West with a data set that goes back to 1848 and that is now publicly available at whogoverns.eu. And because I think that an image is worth 1,000 words, I would like now to show you a couple of graphs, if possible. So basically, what you see here is using Pedersen index of electoral volatility, the level of stability at the electoral arena of party systems, distinguishing between three regions: Eastern Europe, the line, Southern Europe, the points, and Western Europe, the dash. What you can see here is that at the electoral level, Eastern European party systems, even if still very unstable, in fact, more than 20% of voters change parties and preference from one election to the next, are becoming more stable in the electoral arena. While the South and Western European party systems, the level of volatility is increasing, and this is very interesting for the West, which has reached the threshold that Pedersen talked about when looking at earthquake elections. So 50%. So we could say that nowadays almost every election that takes place in the West, is an earthquake. In fact, one looks at, the Journal of West European Politics and at the summaries and reviews of elections, and the titles are tsunami, earthquake, hurricane. So clearly, there is a higher degree of instability in the West and the South. And this, in clear contrast, this convergence that we see at the electoral level, It's in clear contrast with what we see, for example, in the interwar period, where what we have basically is an asymmetric convergence, in the sense that both South and Eastern European party systems became electorally more stable, just trying to mirror what was happening in the West, right? And this is something that can be explained. For example, Chiaramonte, Manuela, and Soares have an article in Government Opposition where they talk about the explanation being the alteration volatility, meaning the higher number of new parties and party system fragmentation that takes place now in the West. And in fact, this is something that you can see in the next graph that comes directly from our book. You see that Western European and Southern European party systems used to have, below 4-3, effective parties. You see it in the 80s and before. In the 90s, Eastern European party systems were, still very fragmented, but soon, catch up, with Western Europe, and are now, even converging with, Southern Europe, which has, of course, especially after the 2008 Great Recession, increased, in the level of fragmentation to the point that reaching, since the end of the Second World War, the highest level. In my own work, I have found, basically two reasons for this. Sociological, clearly the thawing of, traditional cleavages in the West due to the process of, globalization, and of course secularization that makes the West closer to the East, where cleavages have been weaker, or if we take Bartolini and Mer, seminal definition, in some cases we can say that they were not even cleavages at all. But also, from institutional point of view, in the sense that electoral systems in the East have done a very good work in reducing the level of fragmentation. They are mostly more disproportional than you can find in the West. It is also very interesting to see once again the contrast with the interwar period in the 30s. There you cannot see at all any process of convergence. But this convergence, is not only at the electoral and parliamentary arena, but you can also see it at the governmental arena. And this is the center of our new book. We use the notion of, created by Peter Mer, party system closure, and we use a new indicator that we have created specifically for the book, where we look at the levels of stability of patterns of interaction at the time of government formation, weighted by time. And we can see that while Eastern European party systems are still more open than Western and Southern European ones, what we clearly see is that in the West and in the South, especially after the 2008 Great Recession, has been an openness, a decline in the level of predictability in the structure of competition. While familiarity of governing formulas and access to office have been, for example, more close in countries like Hungary, Poland, Croatia, North Macedonia, Georgia, or to mention the last Eastern European elections, Albania, new governing parties have appeared in Greece, my own country, Spain, France, Iceland, and totally unseen and unpredictable coalition governments have appeared in Italy, Austria, Norway, Spain, and to mention perhaps the last one, Ireland. For the first time ever, we see a grand coalition between Fianna Fáil and Fianna Gael. And you see also that while you see this kind of symmetric convergence between the East and the West at the level of party system closure, in the case of the interwar period, the convergence was more asymmetric, in the sense that it was the East and the South that they were coming to the levels of the stable and ideal West. Perhaps this is what led scholars at the very beginning to think that this would be the future of party politics in post-communist Europe. In the book, we try to look at this convergence, and we try to explain this difference in the level of party system closure by looking not just at the decreasing levels of party system fragmentation in the East, as we saw in the previous slide, but we also see that there is a sharper decrease or process of party deinstitutionalization in the West and in the South. And also we see that there is an increase in the level of polarization. Equally, in the south and in the west. And in this sense, we could explain, this convergence. To conclude, trying to answer, the question now. So we see a clear convergence between, the east and the west. We see that this convergence is taking place at the three arenas of inter-party competition, so electoral, parliamentary, governmental. We see that the process is totally different to what we could see, for example, in the interwar period, where we have, the three, regions and this comparison between east and west. At that time, there was no convergence, or the convergence took place in an asymmetric way, not symmetric like now. And also, we clearly see that what is happening is not what it was predicted, that, the east would become as stable as the west. What we see is that it's the west that is becoming as unstable as the east. So just to end with more colorful words that our friends and colleagues, Tim Houghton and Kevin Deegan-Krantz usually put it in their new book, "The future lies east." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you. And now I will ask Zsolt to address us. And for him, the additional question is there something specific about the Central and Eastern European region which comparative research still ought to focus on? Zsolt, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Petra, for the invitation and for the kind words. So let me say as an introduction that I think it's wrong to automatically group countries into East and West, because often there are other more consequential divides. Having said that, legacies matter, and the concept of path dependency can be applied not only to institutions, but to entire constellations of conflicts, just like Stein-Rocken has showed us. So there is a lot of legitimacy in probing into post-communist versus non-post-communist differences. In the book that Fernando summarized, we look at the relationship between party system closure and democracy at two different levels. We look at how party system closure influences the survival of democracies and their quality. Now, when it comes to survival, we find a strong correlation, in the sense that there are virtually no examples of closed party systems collapsing and democracy being replaced by another type of rule. It's an asymmetric relationship, in the sense that there are systems that are open and yet they survive. And here there is a difference between East and West, because most of the examples come from the East, that are systems that are very open and still surviving as democracies. It's very difficult to disentangle whether this is a regional effect or a cohort effect, because the last cohort of party system, the ones that were created at the end of the 1980s, beginning of 1990s, are of course mostly coming from Eastern Europe. We find, however, much larger differences or more interesting differences when we look at the quality of democracy. In Western Europe, quality of democracy and the degree of party system closure is typically not closely associated. In post-communist Europe, we do find an association, and it is to some extent different from the one that we would expect. So if I may show just one slide, the slide that you can also find in the book, that groups East European party systems according to the quality of democracy along three different monitoring agencies and closure. What you see is that there is a group of countries, basically Montenegro, Hungary, Albania, North Macedonia, and Georgia, which are high on closure but low on quality of democracy. And there is another group of countries, Slovenia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Czechia, Slovakia, which tend to be low on closure, but relatively high on the quality of democracy. Of course, this is something that changes from year to year to some extent, but the overall configuration stays the same, which indicates there are two paths in Eastern Europe, one where conflicts are dispersed and another one where conflicts are concentrated. The degree of institutionalization is high, but what gets institutionalized is either clientelism or the predominance of one force over the other, also polarization, mutual distrust. So in this case, the degree of institutionalization is actually undermining the quality of democracy. Now, let me quickly mention 7 other features that I find relevant when it comes to the East-West comparison that comes from some other studies. One interesting finding that we had with my colleague Bojan Todosijevic was that in Western Europe, partisanship, party identification leads to higher satisfaction with democracy. In Eastern Europe, it doesn't have that kind of effect, but it leads to higher degree of radicalism. This means that the integrative impact of partisanship doesn't materialize in East as well as does in the West, and we don't know exactly why is it so. The other interesting difference concerned party loyalties and class effects. We know that both of them are declining in the West, but they are still much, much stronger than in the East. So in this regard, the two regions are still very far from each other. The third is the structure of the political space. It has been discovered by Kitcheld and others already back in the 1990s that in Eastern Europe, you have some sort of protection versus freedom polarization, as opposed to the left versus right polarization. It's, in different words, this is left authoritarianism versus right libertarianism. Much of it survives, interestingly. It has not been washed away. There is also a priority on cultural matters in East that we sort of inherited, and the West is catching up in that regard, but still not where the East is. Then the fourth one is the role of ethnicity. It is important in specific West European countries, but it's much more important, much more powerful factor in East, and Jan Rovni and others look into the influence of this factor. Then there is also the related issue of importance of clientelistic strategies in party competition. And what is also relevant in this regard is the role of informal structures. So to some extent, one can argue that the subject we are studying, those of us who study parties, is not the right subject, because there are some informal mechanisms behind formal party organization and political institution that really matter, at least in most of the East European countries. The sixth one is elite agency. You do see spectacular examples of that in the West as well, nowadays with Macron, earlier with Berlusconi and so on, but it's much more important in East in general because of the role of strong men. And finally, the specificity of populism in government or populist establishment. This is something that soon the Westerners will also know more about as soon as Salvini is elected as prime minister. But this is something that we could teach them about quite a lot. That's it.
Thank you so much, Zsolt. This was so informative. Thank you. Now we will move to Lenka. And for her, the two questions were, your book, Extreme Reactions, focuses on the backlash against minority rights following accommodation of minority demands. Currently, the world is in the midst of culture wars, and we are observing backlash against LGBT rights both in the East and in the West, often in the absence of previous accommodation. How would you extend your theory to these cases? Lenka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Michel and Petra for your kind invitation. As Michel mentioned in his kind remarks, I studied at the Faculty of Social Sciences. I studied sociology and social policy, and over time I migrated, and we met with Petra many years ago at a a xerocopy machine at the Institute of Sociology. So hooray to dying xerocopy machines. So as some of you might know, let me just, before I sort of go to the specifics of Petra's question, let me just say that I think this is a very important panel, that I think the East-West divide is alive and well. And in some way, you know, when I thought about what I've wrote, and in some way my book contributes to the East-West silo in the sense that it was explicitly written as a book that addresses, you know, Eastern Europe, or the so-called Eastern Europe. However, since the beginning, the ambition was the book is to develop a theory that hopefully might apply in the West or in other countries. And one thing I would like to mention, one important thing that I think associated with my book is that, you know, there is a West-East divide, but there's also an East-East divide, in the sense that a lot of, you know, very brilliant scholarship on Eastern Europe comes from the scholars of the V4 countries, you know, the usual suspects, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, Hungary. But there is also an East and there is also a South. So one of the very important things in my book was to think about the case of Ukraine, and the importance of the case stems from the fact that it shows sort of limitations of some of the, you know, theories of radical right mobilization that were developed in the West. And really, the Ukrainian democratic resilience is something that we need to really think about, because if you sort of think about structural conditions and many other factors going into democratic resilience, Ukraine defies it all. So I would call not only for bridging the East-West divide, but also bridging the West-East-East divide. And of course, you know, it is in the true Oriental sense, the way the scholarship is produced is that you take, you know, outstanding, excellent theories in the West, and you apply them to a backwards region, be it, you know, Latin America, Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and then you just hope and beg that the West scholars of Western Europe pay attention to your work. So that's, you know, where I'm at. But you know, to go back to Petra's question, the main argument of the book, as Petra outlined, is it sort of argues that that radical right mobilization stems from a backlash against expansion of rights by ascendant minority groups. So it's a reactive theory in which the book sort of argues that prejudice against minorities is not a sentiment exclusive to right-wing voters, which is actually something that was discovered by Jens Rydgren, a prominent Swedish sociologist that inspired my work. But it shows that variation in how minorities are accommodated explains electoral success of radical right parties. And the book mostly deals with ethnicity, but it also deals with issues of social conservatism. And I think the you know, the theory in my view is flexible enough to address issues of LGBT mobilization and mobilization around gender rights. And, you know, we have also worked on this issue together with Petra, because at the core of the argument is the idea of shifts or changes in the status quo, or demands that, you know, that rattle the cage. And we have seen in past, you know, 10, 15, 5 years, a big shifts in the status quo, in the sense that the LGBT community, you know, came out of the closet, as is one of the articles that we published with Petra, and is demanding, you know, registered partnership. They're demanding to be treated not like, you know, pedophiles and dogs. And they want to adopt children. They want to have, you know, they want to live in dignity. And this is something that changes the status quo, in the sense that the, you know, status quo under communism or even after 1999 was, you know, don't ask, don't tell. As you know, homosexuality was criminalized for a long time. So it is a process that creates backlash. I mean, the silver lining in the theory is that, you know, backlash in the short run, but, you know, perhaps some reconciliation in the long run. And the same, I would say, goes for gender rights. There are, of course, many reasons why gender rights are being activated these days. But I think, in a sense, you know, the theory can be applied as well. In a way, you have a situation, especially you have a sort of rise of new professional class of women and women that grew up after 1989 who suddenly demand things like equal pay. They demand not being touched inappropriately in their workplace, and it shatters societal norms. Again, it changes the status quo. There is a demand to change legislatures, maybe institute some quotas. So in that way, as broadly the theory was written, is I think it can be applied. Of course, as I always say, the devil is in the detail. In the book, I tried to figure out indicators of status elevation, and that is always very difficult, especially once you traffic in, symbolic domains or domains in which it is very difficult to pinpoint what would be the measure of status elevation. But I think once you do that, it can be tested and hopefully expanded, but we will see. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenka. You are 5 minutes in, and here is your second question, so I won't let you get away with it. So your recent work was also on political violence in Ukraine, and we have all seen the events of January the 6th in Washington, D.C. on our TV screens. In your opinion, is political violence a threat, a credible threat to contemporary democracy in the East and in the West?
So as you know, I work in the United States in Arizona, so I'm always very worried about students who are unhappy with me because I know they can shoot me at any minute. So certainly if you think about the West broadly, and if you think about what happened in the United States on January 6th, you have to contemplate the possibility that radical right mobilization, of course, spills over into uncivil society or extremist, societal mobilization that can have sort of, very serious political implications. Of course, there are big, variations in gun ownership and access to violence in Western Europe and the United States and in Ukraine. But I think in general, I would say that the threat of violence, the threat of physical security to minorities, and sort of the general sense of physical safety is something that needs to be studied more. And and when I talk about extremist mobilization, of course, there is a very well and robust field that deals with terrorist attacks. But I think we have to start taking seriously what happens to voters or to citizens when they don't feel as members of the LGBT community. We sort of see in Poland already there is an exodus, and this will have voting implications. I mean, I also think that anti-Semitism is something that we have to be reckoned with. For example, in the United States, of course, nobody underestimates the violence against members of the African community, but the fact that a lot of the data suggests that there is a really, serious spike in anti-Semitic attacks, nobody in a way pays attention to it and takes it seriously. And I think similarly, the threats of violence, the threats that scholars get, by, Sarah De Lange can certainly speak to this more than I do. The fact that there is bullying, cyberbullying, threats of violence, and this is, and this is sort of a new toolkit, I think, of radical right mobilization that has to be taken very seriously.
Thank you, Lenka, for this important answer and highlighting these important issues, including academic freedoms and relationship or the peril facing scholars of radical right in their real life, both online and offline. I would like to move to Ondrej, and for Ondrej, I have these two following questions. So, in your work, you focus on political mobilization and social movements. So, Mark Murray Howard famously saw significant weakness of the post-communist civil society. Looking at the vibrancy of protests, from women's protests in Poland to million moments for democracy in the Czech Republic, does your research detect a significant weakness comparing social movements in the East and the West? And are there significant differences, and can they be traced to the previous regime perhaps? And the second question, in your book with Manuela Caiani, Radical Right Movement Parties in Europe, You focused on radical right movement parties. Can you elaborate on transnational cooperation among these movement parties? Are they successful in bridging the East-West divide? So are there not just these nice bridges, but also radical right bridges? Ondrej, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for inviting me for this super interesting discussion. And before coming to these two specific questions, I will also reply to the general one, namely how to deal with these specificities versus general trends kind of thing. In my research, I actually focus mostly on Central East European context, but always try to interpret my results in the discussion with the results coming also from different contexts, which is the only way I think which comparative politics should be done. And the examples I have is on activism, forms of activism, and then some other ones. So, you know, in Eastern Europe, a new type of activism, was detected, sometimes called transactional activism, activism which is non-participatory, based on organizational cooperation. And if you look at it in a broader context, if you interpret this in a context of available research also from other contexts, you can see that it might not be that specific and unique to this post-communist context, but it very much resembles types of activism which developed also in the West, largely in the last quarter of the 20th century, sometimes labeled activism without members. And it also then calls for further research, which I have done on the diffusion mechanisms and how different policy content and how different models travel across regions. And this is also possible way how to approach this this kind of East-West divide, because it might not exist even in reality. It has been already crossed on different levels and in different social spheres. And what I have done in my research was basically studying the ways how political activism and civil society organizations cross this divide. Looking at the same problem from a different angle, I can say that based on my research, there is as much variation in the region or within the region as there is between these two macro regions. For example, I don't think that we have any particular type of East European form of protest or populism, for that matter, which is very much discussed topic lately. I did some comparative work on Central East European countries and regarding protest agenda or national protest agenda, which is concept basically describing the profile of protests in a given country. And what we have actually learned is that in these different countries we can see differently organized protests. And we also try to account for that, and we used an argument based on different configurations of party politics. So linking up not only trying to link up not only East-West divide, but also this divide between people working on political parties and social movement and protest. And similar thing can be said, I think, about populism and how it developed in different countries, how it presents itself, and what are its implications, which are far from uniform across different countries. The examples which I could use here would be the Czech Republic, the country I'm sitting in right now, where we identify usually this technocratic type of populism with its signature slogan, "Let's run the state as a firm," right? And then if you look at for example, the Hungarian case, which is very close, and Hungary understood as part of the same context of Central Eastern Europe, this form, the type of populism which developed in Hungary differs very much. It's not based on economic arguments, or it's not. It doesn't present itself with the help of managerial logic and rhetoric, but it's openly nationalist, and it's deeper kind of, based in discussing national identity, not effectiveness of the state. And its main presentation and also, policy implications, I think, differ greatly. All in all, I would say that there is no one type that fits all, even in Eastern Europe. In that sense, and I'm in agreement with other people speaking here, on the panel. This East-West divide can actually hide as much as it reveals, and to make some kind of illustration with also research by other people. Sean Henley has lately discussed this problem of democratic backsliding in Eastern Europe, and also calling for this more nuanced approach, basically calling for the end of this backsliding paradigm, and claiming that in different contexts we can see different manifestations of this process. And if we understand that, we can also react to these different manifestations in a more adequate way compared to if we just see just one process in all of these different contexts. And now coming to the specific questions asked in the beginning, might speak political participation and differences between Eastern and Western Europe. I think that here, as again, based on research, we need to distinguish political participation as something taking place on the individual level, and basically describing the ways people engage in politics from political activism, or organized civil society, which is the focus of my research, more than individual level political participation. And while this mostly survey research from individual level really shows these differences, showing on average, although there are exceptions, but on average showing lower levels of participation in East European countries. The same cannot be said probably about organized civil society. And there is a lot of research basically showing that after the fall of communism in post-communist countries, groups of capable advocates and political activists developed, and they were able to organize effective political campaigns. Again, to summarize it and to conclude, I wouldn't say that you can, end up with saying civil society in Eastern Europe is weak. It needs to be specified. It needs to be also contextualized. And said like this is a kind of sweeping generalization. And the last one, and I'll be very short here, is on these transnational influences, which is related to my research on diffusion. And well, yes, of course, also radical right organizations and political parties cooperate, that we know. Particle ways are sometimes, hidden and difficult to research. But I would say that what actually changed lately is the whole context of this transnational cooperation and diffusion. While in the first decade after the fall of communism, what we could observe in Central Eastern Europe was more this, liberal influence, civil society assistance programs, which were helping these good guys, as you put it. It has changed, and both organizations and actors coming from the East, but also conservative organizations coming from the West, started to support a different type of agenda, so-called traditional values, and the whole process has started to be more open-ended, politicized, and not that, dominated by these Western influences. Okay, so that's all for me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ondrej. The answers are always more complicated, and I think that makes our work exciting. So I would like to now move to Milada. If you are hearing rain, it is because there is rain. So I apologize for that. But moving to Milada, so the two questions in addition to the general one, and I leave it to Milada to pick and choose. So in your book, Europe Undivided, which I think is a total classic, you have focused on EU leverage over 6 post-communist accession countries. And so fast forward to today, in what ways did the EU learn from the accession processes, as well as the recent democratic decline in some of the member states like Poland and Hungary? Some see the EU's new rule of law mechanism, which will apply to all member states, as a beneficial. What is your take? Is it useful? Is it too little, too late? And finally, in your recent article, Populism, Democracy and Party System Change in Europe, you compare party system change in Central and Eastern Europe, Western and Southern Europe. You show that while left and central left largely remained unchanged, the mainstream right radicalized. Is your concept of ethnopopulism a more useful tool than radical or extreme right to conceptually bridge the East-West divide? Milada, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you so much for organizing this, Petra, and for inviting me. This is a wonderful event, and I've already learned so much from the other panelists. These are hard questions you've given us, Petra, and I have my crystal ball here so it can help me with the EU question. But I'll start with that one, and then I'll move to the comparative politics questions. I've been reflecting a little bit on sort of EU leverage in the context of the quality of democracy. And I think one way to sort of reconceptualize EU leverage over the candidate states in Central and Eastern Europe is that EU leverage actually tempered the power of incumbency. Because what you see today is that in new democracies, and well, they're not so new now, are they? 3 decades on, but still, we see the tremendous power of incumbency, right? That once a party like Fidesz or PiS gets into power with a majority or an absolute majority, and if they're willing to bust through not just institutions, but also norms of behavior, then they can do a tremendous amount of damage to liberal democracy. And this is democratic backsliding. You can find another term for it, but there's no question that they have eroded, the liberal democracy, both the institutions and the norms. And so EU leverage, in a sense, tempered the power of incumbency, right? So if you were in power during the accession process, you had to watch what you did. And you can see that a little bit today with Vučić, in Serbia. There's a terrible things on the civil society and media, but there are still some limits, I think, to what he does. So what about today? Fast forward 20 years for the East Central, Southeastern EU members who are post-communist or not. What can the EU do today to safeguard the quality of democracy? And I think the academic answer is to go back and just point out, because I think it's so important to point out, that the European Union is only good at those things where EU member states have agreed on the acquis. This is a very simple point, but it is so important. And so EU member states never agreed on an acquis in terms of protecting ethnic minority rights. As a result, in the 1990s, the EU was scrambling to outsource its leverage to the OSCE, the ICTY, the Council of Europe. Something happened, things did get better, but very little leverage today in that area. Same with fighting corruption, and same with safeguarding liberal democracy. And you can argue that a crisis can push countries, EU member states, to then move forward in terms of European integration. We see that with the financial crisis, right? You had a big push forward after the financial crisis in terms of banking union. So crisis was followed by greater integration. We don't see that with the migration crisis, and we are not seeing that very effectively with what you could call the crisis of regime type in the EU. I think it will be helpful, but not in a direct, immediate sense, right? Because we have member states that will oppose it, veto it, and of course Hungary and Poland, but other states as well, right? It's not just Hungary and Poland. And so I think the impact will be the same as in the 90s. Part of the impact of EU leverage was supporting domestic groups. And so if these EU mechanisms and reports can help strengthen domestic groups that support rule of law, that want to roll back attacks on democratic institutions, and help opposition parties that are making these kinds of appeals to the voters, then I think they can have a real impact in the medium term. Okay, but nothing quick. And I think I have to say today the EU faces a huge test, right, with the events in Belarus and the state hijacking of a dissident. This is a real moment for the EU to show where it stands when it comes to regime, and whether Hungary and Poland and others will be successful in decoupling the European Union from liberal democracy, human rights, protection of journalists, and so forth. So let's see how they do. In terms of the second question, and now I only have 5 minutes left, you know, I'll be brief on the beginning. I think, you know, we obviously have had very specific trajectories of regime change after 1989 in Central and Eastern Europe. And what I find so striking is the variation, right? That among all those trajectories of political change before 89 and after, there's tremendous variation and richness in the post-communist region that many West European scholars sadly miss. Today, you know, we still have that great variation of trajectories both in the East and the West, but we have, I think, you know, as much as the substance of political competition still differs, I would say, you do see a real convergence, not just in the instability also that Zsolt and Fernando talked about, but also in the structure of competition. You see parties in the East and the West taking very similar positions. They're converging, and one place that they're converging, which you mentioned in my recent work, is these, what I call ethno-populist parties. And the reason I call them ethno-populist, first of all, it captures a broader category of parties, because Fidesz is ethno-populist and peace, but so are the British Conservatives under Boris Johnson, this transmogrification of the British Conservative Party. You know, and so is ANO, for example, in the Czech Republic. So it captures a broader category of parties that have very similar to appeals to voters in terms of the us versus them, although, you know, flexible in the content of that. But it's a cultural appeal, right? A cultural appeal about us versus them, and about keeping out culturally harmful outsiders or removing their power. And it's not just about appealing to voters, it's also about justifying attacks on counter-majoritarian institutions, on minorities. Essentially, it's a way to justify democratic backsliding, if you want to use that term, or justify majoritarian government, right? Basically saying, you know, if the majority of the people want it, that's democracy. And very, very clearly attacking counter-majoritarian institutions. And, you know, the British Conservative parties are now trying to restrict access to the vote, right? They've just said that everyone will have to register, with obvious consequences for people who are homeless, who don't have the right identification, and so forth. So right out of the kind of ethno-populist textbook. Now, what's interesting, I think, is that to what extent these parties, and Zsolt and Enyedi has also written about this, to what extent these ethno-populist parties have adopted a common script that is external, in the sense that it's a sort of common distant set of enemies that are cosmopolitan, European elites, the European Union, international institutions, but also Islam and Muslim refugees. And we see that in the Chapel Expert Survey across all of these parties, how Islamophobia, with the exception of the British Conservatives who don't score highly on this, but Islamophobia is a position that is equally kind of central to Fidesz and to Salvini and to the Freedom Party in Austria. And so we have a very unfortunate convergence there. And this has also allowed them to cooperate, right? And so ethnopopulism is about culturally harmful insiders who are LGBTQ minority or feminists or liberals, and this kind of transnational conspiracy. The differences, of course, are the constraints of the institutions. And so we still see a difference between East and West. The question is, what will happen if Salvini was to get a supermajority in Italy? I mean, it won't happen, but if it did, we would expect him, I think, to take many of the same kinds of steps that we've seen in Poland or in Hungary by the PiS or Fidesz governments. Let me very quickly, I have 1 minute to show you a couple slides. If I can find my slides. Here we go. This doesn't count. This is just for help me find my slide. Here we go. Okay. This is for the Czechs. I hope you're watching. My favorite Czech protester. So here are just a couple charts from the Chapel Hill Expert Survey, and more of these charts can be found in my new article that Petra mentioned. So here we see how, on the bottom axis, you have the salience of anti-establishment rhetoric, and ethnopopulist parties that are right-wing populists, but I don't like the right, oops, don't do that. I don't like the right wing because, as we see in the Chapel Expert Survey, many of these parties are now adopting left positions when it comes to the traditional economic left and right. So they become very similar. Here you see Austria and Italy, the FPO, the Liga, and the Brothers of Italy. They all take very similar positions when it comes to the salience of anti-establishment rhetoric, as well as immigration. And this is a chart that's very hard to read, but it shows you across all of the cases of ethnopopulist parties that I looked at, the salience of anti-Islam rhetoric, and it's very high for all of them, except for the British Conservative Party. So that article is listed up here if you want to see the charts and actually have a chance to absorb them. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Milada. And for our international viewers, the protesters said it's so bad that the Czechs started to pray. And it refers to the traditional secularism of the Czech Republic, which you wouldn't guess from the number of churches. So sometimes correlation is not causation. Okay, thank you to all of you for keeping on time, for answering questions. The advantage of inviting people is that you can ask them things you always wanted to know about their work. So thank you so much. I have learned so much, and I hope so did our audience. And speaking of our audience, we have received 3 questions here. So I have one directed at Fernando, one at Milada, and one which doesn't address, which addresses the panel. So to give Milada a moment to breathe, I would start with the middle question, and whoever wants to answer, feel free to answer it. So Kenneth Ferstel, if I pronounced your name wrongly, please don't be mad at me. So he asks, or they ask, do the authors observe a lot of policy or political learning of far-right parties? Are they using each other as models to become more effective in taking and maintaining political control?
Well, just to confirm what Milada said, yes, they do. And this is, I think, a very important difference compared to the 1990s, when you had very diverging authoritarian initiatives in the region. Now they try to come together, they learn from each other. This is something that it's, in a way, we encourage them to do. I mean, this is what the European Union is about. What complicates the picture to some extent is that, of course, it's not only EU actors who are relevant here, but Russia, for example, is also a very important actor.
Thank you so much. Does anybody else want to tackle? Yes, Lenka?
I think this is an excellent question. As a true political scientist, I will always say it's complicated because I think it depends on your definition of far-right parties. If you think of them as niche political parties that are mostly out of power, then their policies are actually very simple. You know, it's an policy based on anti-ethnic, it's an anti-ethnic minority position and a highly socially conservative position. So I don't think there is that much learning because they're already at the extreme. However, if you think about some parties, the way I think, but of course not everybody does, as radicalized mainstream parties, then we are, maybe not so much talking about policy, but we are talking about the technology of power. And then, as Zsolt said, there is a fantastic learning process and diffusion. There is a reason why there is something that's called the Orban textbook. But I would like to highlight one aspect that, I think it sort of touches on some of the other questions, is that, weaponization of social policy programs to maintain power and to reward voters for their loyalty. That seems, I have sort of, in my article with Herbert Kitchell in 2009, we already noted that far-right parties are on the left, but I think once you move to the domain of parties of power, this is becoming a very powerful package that's being offered and a very appealing package to voters who are in general quite poor.
Thank you. And Milada?
Yeah, just very quickly. We often think of Brexit as having warned countries, right? Warned them away from trying to leave the EU. But actually, I think, Brexit also has this learning that has happened has been as a result of seeing how the British Conservatives, a small faction of them, could remodel the entire British Conservative Party using this kind of ethno-populist us versus them cast on the European stage and against migrants. And what Lenka says is absolutely right. The two greatest sort of consequences of the rise of populism, particularly culturally right populism in Europe over the last decade, are Brexit on the one hand and authoritarian rule in Hungary on the other. And both of these are the product of mainstream conservative parties that have been remodeled using this ethno-populism. And I think that other parties are watching. And so the question is, are factions within parties, right? So one party I worry about is in Austria, the ÖVP, which already has very similar views to the Freedom Party on a number of issues, and other parties as well.
Thank you so much to all of you, and I think our question was answered. So I would like to move to a question by Michele Zadra. Again, sorry if I butchered your name, and it's for Fernando, and I assume Zsolt. Can you justify why you were grouping Western and Southern European countries? While I may see why Eastern European countries are put in the same basket for comparative purposes, I struggle to understand the rationale for the other two groups. Isn't it possible to find strong similarities across the groups and strong differences within the same group? Isn't the West-South split then a quite artificial and not really effective classification? What am I missing? Thank you. Yeah, Michele, that's how I feel most of the time about the Eastern Europe. But Fernando and Zsolt, the floor is yours.
Yes, to be honest, this is what I also wanted to show, and I think it was Lenka also who was mentioning, that Eastern Europe is not just one basket, right? That we have different regions, and they vary a lot within Eastern Europe. Still, just trying to address specifically the questions, and before I go to give the answer, I would like to say that, in the book, we have, many other classifications according to the degree of closure, according to type of party system, according to trajectories in party system structuration. So it's not, this kind of, regional, according to waves of democracy. And in fact, this allows me to answer the question. I think that despite the similarities between the West and South, most of the countries, democratize at, different times. So in the book, we distinguish between 5 different ways of democracy. So in this sense, we diverge a bit from, Huntington's traditional, distinction. Also because, if we put West, South, and East, we have more or less, equal number of countries in each of the groupings. If we were to put the West all together, we will have, very, unbalanced, number of countries in the West in comparison with the East. Also, because, in the South, there were more and more, and longer breaks of democracy, meaning that, the authoritarian periods, were longer in the South than in the West. But still, even if, we were to follow, the grouping together of West and East, and as you could see in most of the time periods in the 3 graphs that I showed, the South tend to, behave, very similar, to the West. The only thing is that, we didn't want to, let's say, contaminate this pure or more pure, comparison between West and East by, compensating, with the South party systems into the Western European cluster. But, Zsolt may want to add to this.
Just a footnote that, of course, all these groupings are problematic. But interestingly, something happened recently that made the, let's call it, South-West divide more relevant, and that was the 2008 financial crisis. So these countries were affected. The South was affected differently than the rest of Western Europe. East was also affected differently, and the responses were also different. Hans-Peter Kruse and his colleagues had a book about that.
Thank you so much, Fernando and Zsolt, for the answer. And the last question here from our forum, and then I have 2 from Twitter. So this question is from viewer 497255 for Milada. To what extent the European party families such as EEP, PES follow the logic of EU's approach of tempering the incumbencies, in your opinion, and why? Hopefully it's somebody from the European Parliament.
That's right. So I think this tempering incumbency is really a part of the accession process. So this really only applies if a country is still a candidate for EU membership. And here, the European People's Party sheltered, enabled, facilitated, befriended Orban for a decade while he was dismantling liberal democracy in Hungary. So the European People's Party has a huge, this is hugely to blame for the fact that the EU didn't act when Hungary was, democracy was being taken apart there. And why they did that, I still am waiting for somebody to write a really good article about, to what extent was this political greed, just the short time horizon, just wanting to have that power in the European Parliament? To what extent was it affinity with these traditional values that Orban espouses, which have become more and more, homophobic and sexist? I don't know. I think the European People's Party, especially the German CDU, has a lot of blame there. More broadly, I think that these parties could have a positive effect. Fico was suspended by the International Socialist Party, I think, for a while he was in coalition with the far right and the far left. But generally, though, I don't think that this is really where you're going to see the kind of some kind of check on democratic backsliding. I think the problem for the EU is that as an institution, the European Union needs to decide that liberal democracy is a fundamental anchor of European integration. And that'll be a sea change, right? I mean, remember Berlusconi, nobody did anything about Berlusconi. He was clearly dismantling liberal democracy in different ways, busting through norms of things like independent media, but he wasn't exporting it, you know, and everyone just left Berlusconi alone. So the EU will really need to see this as a crisis. And I'm afraid that with so many other things on its plate, this is one of the problems, right? That with the financial crisis and the migration crisis, and also such variation in terms of interest when it comes to dealing with these regimes and dealing with Russia, it is a lot to expect from the EU at this time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Milada. I will now move. We have two more questions we have received from Twitter. So one is by Piotr Marczynski. And I think perhaps it was already answered, but I think I was happy he asked. So I'm going to read the question. With the introduction of the Polish deal by the governing PiS, the party went further in the direction of its conservative vision of the welfare state. Do you think it can be analytically fruitful to perceive it within the context of pan-European shift of the radical right parties towards pro-welfare nativist positions? After all, the journey of law and justice from neoliberalism to conservative statism resembles the invention of Alternative for Germany or Front National, or would it be better to perceive the phenomena as a regional specific? Whoever wants to take.
I think it's an excellent question. I'm sure a lot of people on the panel have thought about this as well. I would like to remind everybody that sort of originally the Western European far-right parties were fiscally conservative with a combination of welfare chauvinism, which is not the same thing as a radicalized mainstream party with access to state resources and patronage, you know, reshaping and targeting voters with welfare policy. So I think, you know, as I sort of mentioned, this is a fantastic new package. We see similar social policies boosting fertility, you know, aimed at boosting fertility in other countries as well, including the Balkans. This is a new deal. It's a response to a huge demographic and labor shortage crisis. But I think, again, the devil is in the detail here, is that you're looking more of, you know, a sort of a, you know, familial policy combined with strong identity politics. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Lenka. Zsolt?
I think it is a great issue to show how convergence and specificity can coexist, partly because of what Lenka said. So in one case, you speak more about ideology. In the other case, you speak more about policies. Because in one case, you have parties in government. In the other case, typically they are in opposition. But the other difference is that the public opinion has always been more pro-redistribution in the East than in the West. And perhaps even more importantly, the intellectual traditions in the East have typically been more pro-statist or statist than in the West. So what you see is indeed similarity and convergence, but from a different starting point and from somewhat different motivations and different implications. And we have to know both the fact that they are getting similar and also the separate reasons why they do so.
Thank you so much, Milada.
Just quickly, I agree completely with Zsolt. And, you know, on the policy level, we also need to look at, I mean, these PiS and Fidesz have been in power long enough that there's some track record, right? And so Dorothea Sikra has some great papers where she actually compares Poland and Hungary and shows that Fidesz has not, in fact, really tackled poverty or child poverty because its kind of nativist left welfare state is really just a way to buy off certain kinds of already wealthier voters. Whereas in Poland, it has had a reduction, there has been an across the board reduction in child poverty. But in terms of party positions, Jan Rovny and others have written a lot about this. We see in the Chapel Hill Expert Survey that Fidesz and PiS are resolutely on the left when it comes to their positions on the left-right economic divide. And that's been true for Fidesz forever. But in Western Europe, it's much more complicated, right? Our experts not sure, there's a lot of blurring, the standard deviations are high, but there is a general trend of these far-right and ethno-populist parties moving towards the left. And in terms of policy, just look at Boris Johnson, right? He's now trying to put some economic substance into his cultural kind of appeals to working class voters in Britain. Let's see if he succeeds.
Thank you, Milada. And I mean, if we could, I think our audience would like to stay much longer, but I will try to take one final question and then give you the opportunity to say a last word. So we would be remiss. We have one question by Tim Houghton. So speaking of the devil, or speaking of Tim, thanks for fascinating panel. If we were to take Europe as a whole, do you see there is a convergence or divergence between Europe and other parts of the world? Is Europe out of kilter and exceptional? How far do the theories we generate from Western or Eastern Europe travel?
So as you know, I'm sure Milada has a lot to say to that, but it would be nice if scholars of American politics read some literature on Western European far right and Eastern European far right. And I think the developments in the Republican Party in the United States point to very, very disturbing trends. And there is, you know, a lot to be learned from our literatures.
Thank you, Lenka. Fernando?
Well, I'm extending the project that I started, you know, in Europe to other regions of the world, and especially, you know, I have been working with a colleague here at the University of Nottingham, Dr. Don Lee, and you know, we find that, you know, I mean, some of the processes that we see in Europe in general, you know, for example, you know, this relationship, you know, between party system stability and, you know, consolidation of democracy, you know, tend to certainly, you know, be beneficial, you know, but there are, of course, you know, other idiosyncrasies, like, for example, the colonial legacies that, you know, you don't have, for example, you know, in the case of Europe, that, you know, complicate a bit the picture, you know. And moreover, you know, I mean, when we think, I mean, when we write in the book, you know, a lot of the literature that we look at when dealing with party system institutionalization comes from Latin America. So, you know, we think, you know, we haven't tested it, you know, but we think, you know, some of the, you know, conclusions that we have in the book could certainly be applied, you know, to the Latin American context. But of course, you know, I mean, they are important, you know, more even the similarities that we can see between, you know, East and West.
Thank you, Fernando. Milada?
I'll just say in one area, right, we do now have a comparative politics literature that kind of spans the globe, and that's populism, right? So many conferences about global populism, and we certainly do see, and I've had students writing about Bolsonaro, about the American Republican Party, about Modi in India, and we certainly do see a very common playbook. And that common playbook has these two steps that I talked about, right? One is, how do you appeal to voters, especially initially, when you initially want to win? And second, how do you concentrate power once you've won the elections? But that global populism literature is also, I think, a problem in some ways, because it generalizes too much across all kinds of populism. And so when we look at the European context, we see populist parties on the cultural right that have a very specific set of appeals, that have taken these steps towards democratic backsliding. We don't see that on the left. Now, that doesn't mean it won't happen, but so far, those left-wing populist parties that have been in power, I don't see a lot of evidence for backsliding. And so I think one of the problems is just in part terminology and getting your paper accepted at journals. You know, the impact of populism is a big subject and a big, everyone wants to show that their article shows. I have like 3 on my desk, the effect of populism on party systems, the effect of populism on democratic quality. But when you actually look inside these populist parties, I think they're very different. And I think it's really important to distinguish, between different kinds of populist parties. So maybe limiting a little bit this kind of global reach.
Thank you so much, Milada. Unfortunately, we won't be addressing the other questions and to go. So I would like to give to all of you a space to say final words, and perhaps it would be if you could integrate. Christian Surubaru has asked us, what type of out-of-the-box solution do you envision in bridging division, artificial as they may be, between East and the West? So I thought that would be a good way to kind of end our panel. So who wants to, perhaps each of you want to say either final words or incorporate some kind of ways to bridge the East-West?
Okay, I think that, we ended up here with discussing the question how to deal with populism in its, different variants probably. And I think that Milada is right, that we need to, take into account these differences and different ways how it presents itself in different contexts. At the same time, it seems to me that also, with this described move to the way how this populist discourse is articulated today, including this economic left basically into its political discourse. What we need is less, discussion, and maybe even European Union cannot do much about that. Maybe, the support for local groups also mentioned here, but I don't think it can be, solved from top down. And what we need in general is a kind of resurgence of social democracy in a different form, probably, or different forms even. I'm not saying that we, should go somehow back, and it's not possible even, but at least, in many East European countries, this space which opened up for, populist parties to acquire was created by a kind of political suicide of social democratic parties or parties which were in that position. And I think that politically speaking and speaking about how to deal with this challenge, this is the only very general suggestion I can have right now.
Okay, so given that it's out of the box, and we can imagine, right? I think that I had the opportunity to write an article with Jose Rama that was published at the Journal of Democracy, in January, and I think that there what we recommend, to tackle the crisis of democracy that we are seeing both in East and West, it was the need for party regeneration. Perhaps we were a bit too idealistic there, right? But I think it is important that there is a new way of transformation of political parties, in the sense that as Ondrej was thinking, it's not about solving the problems from the top. They need that parties need to really institutionalize. We do this argument in the book, but in the sense that I think that both in the East but also in the West, there is this let's say political leaders have forgotten about the importance, for example, of political party organization and the need for really make organizations strong. Perhaps the fact that more and more we have, as we mentioned in today's talk, more new parties that are successful immediately after they are being formed, they tend to forget that it is important for the long term, not the short term, to have this type of very strong organizations, and many other aspects that we look at in that article. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. Who wants to continue? Zsolt?
Yes, I would come back to an issue that has been raised several times, and this is the issue of generalization. So I think it's important to differentiate two things. On the one hand, in what directions system change. And here one can make the claim that there is a general shift towards de-democratization that happens globally, happens almost in all corners of the world. On the other hand, whatever terrible news we hear from France, Denmark, Czechia, and so on, these are different sorts of problems than what you confront in Hungary, Serbia, Russia, and the host of other countries. So we have to stay aware that there are certain qualitative jumps in this process of autocratization. And once you went over a certain threshold, mechanisms also change, and probably scholarship should also change. We should study different issues.
Thank you, Zsolt. Milada, would you like to?
Sure. So a couple of the questions in the chat were sort of asking about how can we explain the erosion of liberal democracy, particularly in Eastern Europe? And one mentioned the failure of the center and the left parties. And that, I think, is an argument that's made across the board in Europe, right? That main center and left-wing parties in a way lost their connection to the voters. And so that's a big literature, and I think that's part of the story. The other question was about capitalist development in the West and whether that has impacted the East. And again, that's a big literature that of course has a lot of great points. I think what is so puzzling, is that the countries that have experienced the greatest backsliding, Poland and Hungary, they are among the very wealthiest. Also the Czech Republic, among the very wealthiest of the post-communist EU members, right? And so it's not a question of having been so disadvantaged by joining the European Union and having their economies integrated into this, into the EU, but there might be a kind of resentment in terms of rising expectations. Joanna Fomina writes about this in her article about Poland with Jacek Kucharczyk, about how kind of people's resentment, it's not so much their action, how they actually are doing, but sort of their senses of resentment. But here I would really point to two things. One is the changing media environment, which I think has been incredibly consequential. In the Czech Republic, for example, we see a huge transformation in political attitudes, especially towards Muslims. And so much of that has been driven by social media, by the control of a lot of the media, by a small number of let's call them political entrepreneurs. And so the juxtaposition of political entrepreneurs, this changing media environment, and the ability to capitalize on resentment is, I think, incredibly important. And so then the question becomes, how does that vary across different party systems, among different electorates? Does it vary based on existing attitudes among the population? Does it vary in terms of how well the independent media is safeguarded and harmful social media is controlled? Does it vary based on the influence of Russia and the ability of a lot of money coming in from Russia and so forth? So I think there are so many unanswered questions, but this is where the really interesting work is in trying to explain the variation. And nobody expected 20 years ago that Hungary would be the one to go, right? And so we have such a rich, I think, set of political developments in the East. And so there's so much great work being done on that. But at the same time, I really believe, and this is why I like your question so much, Petra, for this panel, that East Central Europe is in a way showing what happens when you have these both attitudes, resentments, political entrepreneurs in the political context today, post-financial crisis, post-refugee crisis. Tim Houghton has made this point as well, right? This is perhaps, unfortunately, a time when our East Central European countries are theory generating in terms of political change.
Thank you so much, Milada. Lenka?
Yes, thank you. Last but not least, so this is a follow-up on Milada's thoughts on capitalist development. I think one way to bridge the divide is to have an open conversation whether economic development and economic trends in East, West, and the South are a zero-sum or a positive-sum game. Sometimes it's a positive-sum game for sure. Sometimes it's a zero-sum game, as many books on Greece were written. And so we should really think about political implications of economic policies driven by Western European interests for democratic transitions and democratic resiliency. So, Germany and CDU and EP, I'm looking at you, how much are the assembly factories in Hungary worth, to you? There are obviously very adversarial effects of massive brain drain from the East, and the fact that the West is, plugging nurses, care workers and doctors from the East. This is a social policy that's greatly beneficial, but leaves sort of a scorched earth. When I lived in Prague for 1 year, my daughter is a Czech citizen. I had difficulty finding a pediatrician for her, and that's just like it's a minor thing. So I think having an honest discussion about economic policies, being sometimes incredibly beneficial, and I think an overly economic liberalization was a phenomenon, in some way, a phenomenal success in the East, but there is no free lunch. And I think, especially in terms of welfare provision and social policies, and some of the consequences of migration of care workers are a big avenue of research that needs to be addressed, clearly, and without blaming anyone, but just like understanding that these things have implications and they generate resentment. I mean, going back to some of the topics. Thank you. It was a great panel, by the way.
Thank you, Lenka. I would like to thank, we have come to the end. Unfortunately, I could definitely spend here much more time, but the time has come. So I would like to thank to our panelists, to Fernando, Casal, Bertoa, Zsolt, Enyedi, Lenka Bustikova, Milada, Vachudova, and Ondrej, Cisar for their insightful input, for great answers, and overall such a amazing breadth of knowledge. I would like to thank Michel Perotino, Hanna Kubatova, the Department of Political Science at the Faculty of Social Sciences, Charles University, the ECPR Central Services, Brady Gaynor, and to our viewers for their interest, time, and questions. And I would like to end with a quote by Václav Havel on hope. The kind of hope that I often think about, I understand above all as a state of mind, not as a state of the world. Either we have hope with us or we don't. It's a dimension of the soul. It's not essentially dependent upon some particular observation of the world or estimate of the situation. Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. Thank you very much. Thank you for viewing, and have a nice evening. Goodbye.